ko titirangi te maunga, ko waikumete te awa, ko te wao nui a tiriwa, te papakainga, ko te kawaro a maki, te mana whenua, ko going west, te hui ahure, ko Murray Gray, ko Naomi McCleary a tātou kaumātua, ko James Littlewood aho. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, and welcome to everyone, wherever you are, to all our friends of Going West. Whatever level you might be in right now, you're all super duper welcome here. We're so thrilled to be able to spend the night with you guys. We're going to be hanging out tonight with Airini Beautrais, Rosetta Allan, and Michelle Elvy, three fantastic writers with Michelle Elvy in the captain's seat, guiding us through. But before we get to that, a little bit more from me. You know, last September, we were going to be celebrating the launch of Going West's inaugural book. And, you know, tonight we were also going to be celebrating the launch of Going West's inaugural book. So instead, we can just look at it here, and you can also get it online. You can get it from Unity Books Auckland, and I strongly recommend you do. In fact, it's starting to move. So if you don't, you might miss out. It was described by North and South as a literary festival in a book, and I couldn't put it any better myself. Fantastic array of speakers in this book. I'll just read a little bit from the contents page. Bernard Makoare, Nahuia Te Awa Kōtuku, Robert Sullivan, Morris Shadbolt, Ian Weddy, Vincent O'Sullivan, Fiona Kidman, Michael King, Dame Marilyn Waring, Jeff Park, just goes on and on. Patricia Grace, Tony Simpson, Chris Price, Terada, and Salmon. Just an incredible collection of New Zealand writers. If you've read a New Zealand book, the chances are not only might the writer be in this book, but they probably get name checked as well. Yeah. I want to also just thank a couple of people. Robin Mason and Peter McCurdy and Carolyn Legatahu did a huge editing job. Although we had the transcriptions, converting that into something that reads well on the page was an absolutely gargantuan job. And Robin and Peter and Carolyn, with a little bit of cheering from the sides from yours truly, did an amazing job. Peter Dowling, our publisher at Oratia Media, has a huge amount of faith in Going West, and we're really thrilled to have his friendship and support with this project. And Sarah, oh God, the graphic designer, Marigold Janacek, and Sarah, whose surname I've embarrassingly forgotten, the graphic designers. Sarah has an incredible experience in book design, and Marigold has been designing anything that Going West has been making for print or screen for the last few years, and they really do embody the Going West spirit in that book. Okay, that's way too much from me on that. If you do enjoy tonight, we have donations on our page. You can make a donation to Going West, and you know, it's a hard time, and I know that's a hard time for everybody, but if it is possible for you to spare a few bits of change for us, we would so appreciate that. We make this free and ad-free for everyone forever, so hopefully yeah, if you can spare us anything, we would be humbly grateful. The only other thing I want to point out is that you'll see on our website a little widget down the bottom right hand side. You can click on that and you can send us a question. Please do share your thoughts with us. We'd love to know you're out there. We'd love to know what you're thinking. And if you've got a question, then our fabulous guy, Mark Easterbrook, will be filtering all of those, and he might be able to send it through to the writers, and you'll be engaged directly in the conversation. And that we would love that opportunity. Okay, Airini Beautrais, author of the award-winning Bug Week, Rosetta Allan, author of Crazy Love, and Michelle Elvy, whose recent book of flash fiction, I have beside me a fantastic book, The Other Side of Better. I'm so looking forward to this discussion of dangerous truths tonight. So please, Michelle, take us into the world of dangerous truths.
Kia ora, and thank you, James. Thank you to Going West. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm coming in from Dunedin, as people who know me will know that. It's a real shame we can't be meeting in Auckland, but amazing that this festival is happening anyway, and with an audience that I hope is really excited to hear from the two writers that I have the privilege of sitting with this evening. So I'm really excited to get going. I'll just say a couple words just from my knowledge, my own personal introduction for both Airini and Rosetta. I'm sure that everyone knows their writing and, of course, their most recent books, which are being talked about everywhere. But I know both of them first as poets, and I think it's actually true that both of them, their first work, their first poetry, their first work published was poetry. And in fact, in Irini's case, her first book, Secret Heart, which was published in 2006 by VUP, won the Jessie Mackay Award for the best first book of poetry in the New Zealand Book Awards then. So she has quite a list of awards happening there. And in Rosetta's case, her first book of poetry was also 2007. So it seems to me that both of these writers are sort of working along the same timelines, perhaps. And I find it so interesting that they also come at their writing with such diversity. They've written poetry. Rosetta has had residencies at the University of Waikato and also St. Petersburg, an art residency, and also the Michael King Center. So meanwhile, Airini won the 2016 Lampall Essay Competition Prize. So we're talking with writers who are poets, who are fiction writers, who are also nonfiction writers, and it's a real pleasure. I think the discussion with this fabricated reality idea is going to be really fascinating. One other small note, I first came to their writing personally as an editor with the 2018 volume Bonsai, which was a CUP anthology that we put together of small fictions and small stories. And both Airini and Rosetta are in that volume with prose poetry. So it's a real pleasure to be in the same room, so to speak, with both of you tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to both of them. And what I've asked them for, first of all, I think it'd be really wonderful to hear a reading, an excerpt from each of them. So let's start with you, Airini, and we're going to keep it casual and flowing and fun. So feel free to introduce yourself and the excerpt that you're going to read, say a few words, and then let's hear some of your work. Airini.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Airini Beautrais, tōku ingoa. Thanks for having me, Going West and Zoom. And thank you, Michelle, for your intro. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt from the start of a story called Psycho X. So yeah, this one has been online sometime before the book came out, so might be one that people have seen. I'm going for a run. I pull on my leopard print tights, my black sports bra, my hot pink singlet, zip up my hot pink jacket. Shoes a little worn and in need of replacing. Which footwear manufacturer is the least evil nowadays? I lock my back door, slip the key into the little pocket on my hip. It presses into my skin like a secret. I'm not going up or anywhere near Mount Victoria. So I head up the hill away from the stretch of shops, because uphill is where trees are. I'll maybe turn right at Coromandel Street, go through the town belt around the back of the zoo, check up on the baboons. They always seem so happy in the early evenings. They eat grass and murmur to each other, wurg, wurg. There's the alpha male with his harem of females from just post-pubertal to perimenopausal. There are the young males watching for an opportunity. Then there's the old guy, used to be alpha, sitting off to the side with just one loyal mate left, running her fingers through the few remaining hairs on his head, looking for lice. I reckon she was his first love, and the one who stuck by him. I believe in love. That's what I'd see, if I ran that way. I pass the bus stop, and the traffic's busy, so I don't cross the road. I head up Alexandra Road instead of Coromandel Street. I can run over to Hataitai, and still, technically, not be going to Mount Victoria. The path takes me through the trees. I watch my leopard legs flashing over the grass, the dead brown pine needles. I imagine myself as a leopard running through a forest, powerful, unafraid. You always said I was too colourful. You complained so much about my purple stonewashed jeans. I gave them to the op shop. Then we broke up. I wish I'd kept the jeans. I'm nearing the lookout now, the weird triangular sculptures. The trees open up, give way to sky. The sky's turning pinkish. You can't beat Wellington, I watch my even on a bad day, but Wellington may beat you. I'm dropping down from the lookout, re-entering the forest, like entering a bedroom. But I'm single. Yep, all the single ladies. Waving my hands in the air halfway between freedom and desperation. The hill gets steep here. I have to brace my knees. I'm keeping myself alive, I tell myself. My joints, my tendons, my muscles, my heart. The heart is a muscle that never stops twitching. I'm going down the concrete steps and I'm on your street. But I'll pretend I'm not. I won't look at your house. The psycho ex, the stalker. That is not who I am. I am simply a person who loves you deeply. I've never felt this way about any other man. I feel like Wanda Jackson, down, down, down into the funnel of love. The thing about love is that it isn't insane. Love is the purest, sanest thing any of us will ever feel. That's me for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great little introduction to your writing for people who haven't read the book yet, but wonderful to hear you read it. We've all read it already on the page or online, as you say. So great to hear that. Rosetta, let's hear from you.
Kia ora koutou. It's great to be here. Thank you, Going West Festival. And it's such an honor to be here with you, Airini and Michelle. I'm just going to dive in right in the middle of the book. So they're in diary entry. So 1:10 p.m., 12 August. Billy understands the guilt left behind after a suicide. He tells me this over and over, keeps crying too, especially when he's playing that god-awful Turning Tables song that I will never, never, never forgive Adele for. It's the only song on his playlist at the moment. He sits behind his big screen advertising computer watching YouTube of her sitting on the stool, casually turning out those breakout words. Billy cries between each line. Can't breathe, he sings. I won't ask you to desert me. And is it time to say goodbye? Then that chorus strikes up, and I want to fucking strangle her for putting ideas in his head. Has he any sense of responsibility for her words? Between the sobs, the drinks, the marijuana, and whatever else he's taking, both prescriptive and non, Billy reassures me that I've been a wonderful wife, that his time with me has been the best of his life, that I am not to think that he's doing this because of anything I've done. I'm doing this for you, he said today. We were sitting in the waiting room, waiting for the doctor, waiting for Billy to tell the doctor that he needs to take anything out of his file that shows a pre-existing condition that might cancel out the life insurance policy, waiting for him to tell her that he's planning to kill himself, waiting to see how she will deal with that dilemma, waiting to see if Billy's confession makes me burst into tears with the relief that someone other than myself knows what's going on. There were no tears when Billy told me he was going to top himself for my benefit, only a weird glint of glee in his eyes because he's actually looking forward to being the hero. He leaned in, luminous, as he watched for my response, expecting my approval and possibly gratitude. I retained the non-committal resting face of a deadpan comedian, which has become my natural setting lately, determined not to give Billy anything he can look back on that would indicate I'm in the plan. I have not become Pink Floyd comfortably numb, not numb at all. This uneasy truce now unifies us. I let Billy believe that I'm loyal by staying by his side to help him see his crazy plan through, but I don't buy into the plan at all. I pretend to agree. I want him to get to the doctor's. I want to get into the doctor's office with him, and I want to find a way to persuade him that he's wrong. An inch either way could send him off. So much could be undone if more was said. I read that somewhere. Love is endurance. Love lies too. 3:12 p.m. What's happening is not us failing. It's an illness, like the fungus that turns ants into zombified drones. Billy is not himself. He is not Billy. And I hoped our doctor had the sense to see this for herself today. My heart was full of hope when Billy's name was called, his real name, the name that always feels so strange to me. Wait here, he said before rising. He turned when I rose anyway and pointed to make sure I stayed like an obedient canine. That wasn't what we agreed. I picked up a magazine that I didn't want to read, but would use it to hide the tightness of my lips at yet another of Billy's recent betrayals. Dr. Amanda would do what was best for Billy. She cared about him. I consoled myself with that thought. Billy's a polarizing character, but those who saw him, as Dr. Amanda did, could see the rainbow of true colors. He had that way of bringing out a smile on her face, and she had a way of lingering longer than she needed to with him. They were in there a long time together, and I waited alone and not together, out in the waiting room. Dr. Amanda popped out at one point to check something with the receptionist, and I stood, just in case she had something to check with me as well. One of her doctorly warm smiles was sent in my direction before she padded back to Billy with a manila folder thick with paperwork. There was no sense of disappointment in her eyes. No, I understand, and we're in this together. Collusive nod to her smile. Billy was in there spinning some story. I just knew it, selling her on some reason to see the folder other than the real one.
Thank you so much, Rosetta. It's a great excerpt, coming right from the middle of the book, I should say. It's from the during section. Is that correct? Yeah. So those are really wonderful places to start for both of you. And throwing out here, really the first question, I think the best place to start in this conversation is just talking about love. I have wondered, as I've read both of your books, whether, is love the place that you begin, or is it the place that you end? I mean, is love sort of the unavoidable essential element? Airini, I think you're quoted somewhere as saying that this is a collection of unhappy love stories, but they're love stories nonetheless. And Rosetta, in yours, there's always a strain between a desperation, a longing, a failure even, and then the love that brings people together. So I think this question around love and failure, love and pain, these things are so deeply connected in both of your writings. And I'd love to hear you both just talk about that a little bit, how love weaves its way in such a natural way. Either one of you.
I think when we write stories, we're writing about humans, and I guess the connections between people are where stories come from. I think often a narrative comes out of a situation that isn't clear cut or isn't straightforward, and I guess when everything is going well, there's not a lot to talk about. I think one of the reasons we tell stories is to make sense of the things in life that are painful. And I don't know if this is your experience, Rosetta, but I think that sometimes as writers we need to work through our own painful experience and in some way, or be it through fiction or poetry or another form, like just trying to cast something into a text and see, what can I make of this if I write it down, if I make some characters act it out. Yeah, trying to make sense of things that can be very big and confusing and potentially very dark.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a specificity there, isn't there? You can write these very specific characters to address these kind of bigger, more nebulous themes. And I think love is, of course, the biggest one. Rosetta, what about you?
Well, I think in writing about this love story, which to me it is a love story, is very much what Airini was saying. You're processing your own experiences as well as creating story. So the love, when I think about love, I also think about heartbreak. So one of the reasons why I decided to actually write this story, and it was a story, I was never going to confess that it was drawn from my own life until the very last minute. So I was writing it, sort of tricking myself that it was just a novel, which gave me a lot of freedom to be very honest about the relationship. and the experiences of having a husband dealing with bipolar 1, but particularly going through a bipolar manic period, which lasted 3 months, where he lived that entire time 24/7 in the outside of our house in the garden, which is quite bizarre behavior. And at that point, I did not know that he had a diagnosis of bipolar 1. So there's that, the love that that I think I'm talking about is a long love. Is we had been married 27 years at that point, and we would often be asked, because we are a terribly romantic couple, and we show it liberally. What's the secret to a long marriage? And I kept getting asked this, and I keep thinking, well, there's no secret. And so I guess when I'm writing Crazy Love, I'm actually trying to unravel what it is that makes our particular relationship, Billy and Vicky's particular relationship, a success in my eyes, which may not be successful in other people's eyes that are not willing to have that sort of dependency that Billy and Vicky have on one another. That's all encompassing, really. And just to see if I could answer some of those questions.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. And in both your cases, the way there's this line between truth and fiction. And of course, that's one of the topics that we're interested in getting at here. And in your case, Rosetta, of course, quite obviously, because there's this real blurring of the lines, you quite deliberately call your book a novel. And yet there are these photographs that are real, and you've admitted to it being really very much based on your own reality. And actually, I think in a review that I read by Sue Orr, I think she goes so far as to say that she just decided to call it a memoir to herself in order to read it. So, I mean, it does always the reader's interpretation as well. But what I find really interesting about what you're both talking about is this idea that you are writing fiction in both of these cases, but you're also writing reality. And in that sense, you're writing truth. And what I'm wondering is, of course, you're writing to work. We all write to work through our stuff, as Airini said. And I think that's a really good point, because you're both dealing with some pretty heavy stuff in both of these books. But we're writing truth, but you're also fabricating it. I mean, you're inventing stuff all the time. And I'm wondering about that distance that creates. You know, you have these kind of incredibly intimate scenes and characters that we feel so closely, but there has to be a kind of a distance as well, this relationship between how you're telling truths, but also fabricating them. And that links directly into the assignment we were given when we were given this topic. But I like the idea of this fabricating truth. So where is that line for you? And how do you navigate it? Airini, maybe back to you.
Oh, I don't think there's a line.
Yeah, good.
I think it's a blurry thing, like it's maybe like more like a spider web kind of scenario. It's interesting that you mentioned before that we are both also, or we began as poets, or I guess we both are still poets. We've written poems before. Because I think people often come to poetry with the assumption that it's autobiographical, and I feel like that makes poetry a safe place to explore stuff, you know, in a way that, like, could it be made up? Could it be real? No one will ever know. You know, like the I in a lyric poem doesn't necessarily have a name. Yeah, I just feel like there's a lot of fertile territory there for blurring those boundaries. And I don't think it hugely matters, because I think what we're getting at is not telling the truth or not, like, you know, the objective truth. You know, it might be important in a courtroom, or I don't know, if you're writing if you're trying to write a true history of something, or if you're writing a scientific research paper. But I think in fiction, you know, like, fiction can be a lot truer than autobiography. Autobiography can be a lot more fictional than novels. Yeah, there's just a lot of room for hybridizing genres. There's a lot of room for blurring the boundaries, and I think that's really important to be able to do that. Yeah, so I wouldn't say there's a clear-cut line. There's some stuff in that book that's taken from my own life. It's, you know, some circumstances and names have been changed, but there's some stuff that's pretty much word for word true. And then there's stuff that's completely made up.
Yeah, really interesting.
think
And I'm glad that your response was really about this idea of this kind of spiderwebby image, that there is that incredible blurring, and it's very nebulous, isn't it? Rosetta, how about for you, this idea about the truth and the fiction?
I think it's pretty well known that the best stuff that we can bring forward into our writing comes from our life anyway. And you quoted Sue Orr, who decided to read my novel as a memoir, and then there was a review by Stephanie Johnson, who decided to read it as a novel. And I love that slippery space in between. I think it can be whatever you want, and I'm not going to try and fix it down. And on that distance that in initially writing it as a novel allowed me to bring forth a lot more humor, I think, in the ridiculousness of the situation, where I didn't feel like I had to be completely, you know, it would feel like otherwise I was being irreverent to, you know, the seriousness of the situation. And so yeah, that humor just which is a natural part of Vicky and Billy's interaction. Yeah, that can shine through with the distance. So yeah.
Yeah, and that humor also is so human. I mean, it is one of the ways we endure tragedy. You know, the idea, I mean, in both of your books, I think there's a lot always happening underneath that's about the idea of enduring. I mean, the characters do endure, even though it's sometimes very, very dark, and even though they can come to their demise as well. So that humor, I think, is a real key element, because you have to have a way, I think that's a way that you end up connecting with your reader quite a lot. But let's stick with this idea about the realities a little bit too, because I think one of the things that's also so engaging in both of your books is that your stories that you're telling are very grounded in realities that are familiar to us. So the reader comes to it and we recognize a place, or we can identify with the way a house's furniture is arranged, or we can certainly understand the dialogue because it's a vernacular that we're familiar with. So that idea that I think both of your stories are very New Zealand stories. They're very grounded in the reality of this country that we know. And I was wondering if you sort of begin with an idea, like this idea of love, or do you begin with some kind of grounded reality and then extrapolate out from there? Just that relationship between that very grounding that actually you both do so well. And I think it makes your work relatable for the reader.
If you're talking about the environment that we're creating around our characters, it's really important to give that sense of time and place. So with Crazy Love, we start out in 1984 in a commercial building, and all the orphan Annies, I call them, that are living there, and why they're living there. And it's at the time when Muldoon is about to lose the election and he's almost bankrupted the country, and so there's mass unemployment along with dawn raids and whatever else was going on. It was just a catastrophe of the time, and so there was a lot of unemployment. So for, you know, there's just richness in New Zealand's history, and I think that's also, it comes through in present times. You know, you could what's going on with COVID and how it affects people. So contextually, the concrete, yeah, I guess it is important to have a visceral experience for the reader, but also there's more than that. There's the political of what's happening in the times of these characters with my characters. So we go through 30 years, and how it affects the person too on the ground. So to me, that's just as important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's probably a good place. Oh, go ahead, Airini.
Sorry, I just hadn't really thought about it.
Yeah,
I think I just write from what feels familiar most of the time, I guess. And I just think I'd feel like a wanker trying to set a book somewhere that I haven't lived, or you know, or a story somewhere that I haven't spent a lot of time. I just don't think I can pull it off. I don't think I have the skill to do that. So I think it's easier to just like go back to the places that I lived as a student, and, you know, the town I grew up in, where I live now, and you know, places that I've spent a bit of time in. It feels like a sensible choice. Yeah, it's probably a pragmatic approach.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. I think it's a good time, because we're at the top of the hour, just to put out to the audience that we would love to have questions from you, for anybody who's watching. So you can type them in, and the technical team in the background will send them our way. I see a couple coming in already. But let me stick with this thread first, and then we'll move to some questions. Because I find it really interesting the way you were both talking about, when we're talking about the reality and the details, and then the grounding of these stories and your responses to it. And Airini, I really like your idea that it really is pragmatic as well. Of course, we all know that very famous note that you write what you know, but then of course you explore outwards. But what I find interesting in both of your books also is that we seem to always view characters either in relation to each other or in relation to the place that they are. So whether it's a particular moment in time around the politics and the cultural setting, Rosetta, or the relationship that they are placed in by you, where they happen to be in a particular scene, even the albatross who's at an open mic in a bar, Airini, in that particular story. So do you think that there's sort of this inevitability that, of course, we don't write in a vacuum, everything is relational, and at the same time, you are writing about ideas that are, I don't know, in some sense, maybe they are kind of some absolute ideas, but there's this kind of disconcerting inevitability that there's this proximity to each other that we can't escape. And I'm wondering, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, yes, we're all in this together, but we're also the cause of one another's pain and grief. So that idea of how you're writing characters in relation to their very specific setting or their very specific circumstances of people around them or other characters around them, I find really, really interesting. So I guess the question is, do you think about characters always in relation to something else, or is the character themselves, you know, something that's kind of real and profound and shaped in a way, and then the circumstances come afterwards? I'm quite curious about that. Rosetta, we'll start with you.
I'll take that first. So I can't really separate the two out, as I was exploring before, you know. So this couple, Vicky and Billy, they've married in 1984 and had children in a business. So they've come through global financial crises in 87, 97, then 2007 is the one that does them in the end, and they lose their home and their business, and there's that huge sense of failure, which ultimately is the cause of sorry, my darling, Billy's, there's that murky crossover, Billy's mental collapse 2 years later, and it took that amount of time. And by bringing the characters through that amount of time and seeing where they started and bringing it through, it to me, it really does ground in, I hope, that these crises have long tails and they affect people in different ways, as does COVID is happening right now. So I can't really separate the two. To me, you've got the macro and the micro, so, and they're very much connected. Yeah.
Yeah, that
I like that long-term idea.
Yeah. Yeah, that just reminds me of I did a undergraduate degree in ecology, and so one thing that we often talked about is like the idea of the whole being more than the sum of everything, that, you know, more than the sum of its parts, and how that relates to an ecosystem. But I think it's similar with making art, and, you know, in any medium, that it's really hard. I find it really hard to break a story down into character, setting, and story, and all that sort of thing. Like if you read a text, you know, you can probably isolate things like that, but then if you take one out, the whole thing isn't the same. You know, if you take a character out of a, you know, if you took Rosetta, if you took out your couple and put in a different couple, you know, everything would be different. You know, if you took out the context of the, you know, the house and the business and all that sort of thing, you know, it's not the same. It's not the same work that you're dealing with anymore. So I think, yeah, for me, it's really hard to pin down what I would start with. I think it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's probably like an idea, and then the characters arrive with it, and then you kind of flesh them out as you go, I suppose. Yeah. Does that sound like something you would do, Rosetta, when you know, any other writing that you do? I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because with the writing that the 2 books that I've, so poetry, as you know, you definitely come from the South, and it's quite a brave thing, even though you're creating poetry out of it and kind of story in a different way. And my first 2 books were, I was too afraid to do that. So I really came at other people's stories that I came across. And yeah, that needed a lot of contextualizing with an environment that I didn't know. So with that, I think you're right. I think I started with that and set the characters within that. So with this one, it's been very organic. I really didn't have to think too much about this one, which was quite refreshing.
Yeah, and I like that. I like that idea that, you know, every time it's different. You don't have to have a formula for how you write a book. Yeah.
Well, and it's particularly true in your case also, Airini, because this is a collection of short stories. And I think I might have read, I think it's Harry Ricketts who said, there's not even a necessarily a particular narrative arc in the whole set. And yet there are themes that continuously weave through, of course. So you have these disparate stories, but we're often circling back to some similar ideas. And I think that's what makes it so compelling as a whole. And when you're putting together your short story collection, I also read that it took you've been writing it for 10 years. I think you've said that several times. So obviously it's something that's been with you for a very long time. And we have one question from the audience for you, which is, given that you have these stories over this very long time too, that you've been working on, I find it a great fun question. Do you have a favorite story of your own from your collection, and why?
Not really. It probably depends. It probably depends on the mood. You know, some of them it is a bit of a mixed bag. Some of them are sort of meant to be funny. Some of them are pretty dark. Some of them come from a pretty raw place. I think the story it's called Billy the Pirate Poet. It's one of my favorites. I think it's a fictional story, but that's one where I kind of borrowed the environment from my own life. So I did live in a feminist all-woman large share house in Newtown in Wellington, and there were a lot of comings and goings of various couch surfers. So yeah, that story feels very homely and familiar to me, even though the plot of the story is made up. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's another really good case where even though it's a fictional story, the reality feels so grounded for the reader. I mean, we really feel like we're there in that story.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, of course. Related to that, Rosetta, here's a question for you, and it's about navigating the parts of Billy's real life, you know, from your husband, James. Did you ever feel you needed to be clear about, again, that relationship between the fiction and the reality? Or did you have to get permission for any specific details? That's a question from a listener.
Oh, great question. So my husband has always been really supportive of this story, of this novel, and so he got to read the first draft. He gave me freedom to write whatever I felt like I needed to write, because he knew that, you know, it's ultimately a story of love overcoming and a couple, you know, that proverb of fall down 7 times, get up 8. It's that getting up again, and that is the power of this love story that we felt from the outset. So he gave me the freedom to just write. And usually when I'm writing, I'll give him chapter by chapter to read, but this time I just didn't. I just gave him the beginning, made sure he was happy with the first bit, and then went for it. And so when he read through the first draft, there was only one section that he asked me not to delve into. And so I took that out. And he was just so brave to actually let me put everything out there. So with also knowing that this is only a part of who he is, this is only a fraction of who my husband is. So this is not him incomplete. This mania was, you know, like this little part of his life. So he felt assured that he wouldn't be seen as just this manic Billy. And so when the book was published, and it was the only other time he looked through, he did have a little bit of concern. But like I say, he's been very brave, and the response has been just lovely, which I'm so grateful for. So he's now, you know, very proud of it again, and he's not feeling like he's going to be judged negatively about it. He's still my hero. Billy is a hero. So God bless him.
That's really wonderful to hear you say that. And yeah, interesting. It relates to another question that we have from a listener as well, from a viewer. And it is about that line between the way you're drawing on your own personal history to tell the stories. And actually, before I read the question, it reminds me of something else that I read, this here also by Airini, and it was in a spin-off piece. And you write, books are texts separable from their authors and the biographical circumstances of their lives. But then you also say, I want to consider my experience of writing as a woman born in the 80s New Zealand and how my writing comes out of my life. And then you add, I can't separate writing from my trauma and my anger. And the question here, I think that ties in really nicely to read for the listeners. And it ties in really well with this question that asks to both of you, and we'll start with you, Airini. Has writing reality exposed a certain amount of your own personal history ever in a way that has backfired on you?
No, I don't think so. No, I think for me, stuff that I've written about that's become more problematic for me is writing about New Zealand history. Like I feel like, yeah, I wrote a book of poetry about the Wanganui River, and I still feel, as a Pākehā writer, I still feel a lot of discomfort about that project, which I think is good. I think discomfort's a good place to be when you're thinking about colonization. In terms of my personal life, I'm very happy to share my experiences. I mean, I talk pretty frankly about these things because, you know, some of the difficult experience in my life happened because I wasn't aware that these things can happen. I don't think I was really prepared for everything that has occurred in my life. And you know, I'm a really staunch feminist. I want to help people in any way that I can. If I can help other women to recognize situations that are unhealthy, or to, you know, to recognize that putting yourself first isn't selfish. It's just, you know, it's just what you need to do to stay alive and to achieve your potential. Like, yeah, it's very important to me to be able to be frank about that stuff. So if anyone gets offended about that side of things, I don't have a problem with that, because I think if you feel really passionate about something, it's more important to just go with that and just be honest. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, very much so. And it's interesting because I think you both deal with some really hard material, both venturing into that pain and grief and loss, and questions around mental health and instabilities, recovery, being aware. And these are all the things that you're talking about right there, Airini. So I actually find it really powerful the way both of you handle that, again, through the lens of fiction. But I think we have these greater truths that you're both struggling with. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Rosetta, do you want to add anything about that idea about whether anything's ever backfired on you? You already said, okay, we know James is supportive. Have you ever written anything else where something has made you be extra aware or a bit concerned?
Well, because this is close to life, I'd have had one character that came through and said, asked me, you know, why I had depicted him in a certain way, and I had to remind him, one, that it's fiction, and two, that there's no possible way that you can actually see everything of each character or put it into your story, because you are actually still writing story. So, but also the vulnerability of putting your story, this story out. What I've been so blown away by is that actually that people are actually reaching out and wanting to talk, and I'm making new friends, you know, Zoom friends, and friends that were actually around at that time during those years that we fell down, and then because it took a long time to get back up on our feet after that collapse. But you know, they had no idea. But you can't, because what happens is when you're dealing with something like that, your world gets narrower and you go into management. And so one of the things that Vicky discovers during this novel is how to reach out to people, and realizing that she can't do it on her own and she can't manage this on her own. And so that has become a really important part of not only the book but post-book, and actually having people reach out and talk to me about how it's you know, they could see themselves in the book, and we can have discussions about this, and knowing that they're not alone and I'm not alone. You know, you build up your networks and people that you love that are there for you. So to me, that is just blown me away that that's continuing to happen in a wider way for me because of this book, and I'm really loving that.
I love the way you both talk about how you've come to these stories and how you write them, and just the things that you've said here, both of you. They made me wonder if there is a kind of intentionality, even if it's not head on, but if there's a kind of an underlying intentionality on both your parts, some kind of a message. You know, you talk about your writing is, of course, very personal. It might come from a personal place, but it carries these universal ideas. And that's what makes it so appealing in a lot of ways. So, yeah, when you sit down to write, do you know that you're writing from a place that is going to carry some kind of a message? In the particular case of these two books, did you know you were sort of writing a kind of a, in your case, Airini, you know, you have this incredibly powerful sense of writing for women, writing women, whether they're young girls or older women and all in between. And in that last story, we come to some really powerful stuff about that connectivity. So I'm wondering if you know that when you're starting out, that you're writing with this kind of message.
I would be very wary of the impulse to deliver a message through fiction. I think it's, you know, if you're writing fiction, it's important to tell a story. I feel like if I wanted to get out a message, I would write an article or a blog, because I think that's, you know, that's a more direct way of communicating, you know, opinion or something that you think is important for people to understand in an immediate sense. I think, you know, a story like the last story in my book, which is about that's kind of an allegorical story, I guess, about the position of women in the medical world, but also in society in general. I think that story just came from a place of wanting to tell a story and to explore some ideas. But I think, you know, I feel like for me, when I read fiction, I like it when you know, when I view like film or TV, I like it when the sense of the story sinks in gradually. I don't like to feel like I'm being told what to think. I like to feel my way into it. So I would hope that when I write, I'm conveying that same kind of experience to the reader, and not trying to deliver a message per se.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true in both of your cases. And I mean, that's why I'm curious about this idea too, because both of your writing, it's very experiential, and it is about the narrative first and foremost. It's about the stories that you're telling. And yet, you know, if we read a novel by Toni Morrison, it certainly has a sense of purpose. And I would say that, and that's what I mean about that question around intentionality. Not that you're being didactic in your writing, not that you're immediately, hitting the reader over the head with themes, but that idea of purpose. There's a purpose to this writing in both cases. So, not that I'm arguing with you, Airini, but and I hear what you're saying, but yeah. There's something about the purpose in both of these that I think is really powerful. So, yeah. What about you, Rosetta? Do you feel that you write with some kind of a purpose in your narrative or sense of what it's all about? That idea, what's it all about? People always ask that.
Oh, I think that's great. What's it all about? I think that's actually what we're doing as writers, is actually trying to figure out what's it all about. And I agree with Airini, is you don't really sit down to actually tell your reader something. You're writing for yourself in the first instance, but you're exploring questions, and I would hope that Crazy Love is not actually driving anyone in any particular way of how to think either. I would like to think that it's actually quite open, and I think that's true of all my novels, that I've left it slightly open for the reader to find resolution in their own way as well, with particularly this book. I'm certainly not going to say this is it. It's not the characters need to actually have some change happening within them, but where it lands is you could take that as a little bit ambiguous. What's that word? Ambiguity. A little bit of ambiguity there. I did have a reviewer who once said that I have a vexing habit of leaving things unfinished or unsaid. I'm like, well, I don't mind that.
What's unsaid for one person might be said for another person, eh?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and the idea of it being unfinished, I mean, this is an ongoing project, isn't it, for everyone? Yeah. So whether it's the reader or the writer or the next book that's coming, it's always a bit of an unfinished sense of the narrative. Yeah. We have one other question from the audience, and it's coming back to that idea about poetry and prose. And in both of your works, I mean, we started out by reminding everybody that you're both poets first, and now also poet and prose writers. So this idea that your book was called, I think by O.M. Marshall, Airini, it was called Your Poetic Sense, he said, really shines through. So obviously there's a real care in the writing of the words. And it's evident to me that neither of you is simply throwing down a story. There's a care that goes into the way the words are shaped on the page and the way they're conveyed to the reader, the way that meaning is conveyed, which I think makes them both really beautiful. So this person in our audience has asked about if you could address that a little bit more, that idea of your poetic sense and how you feel it shining through, especially when it comes to a strong narrative, which both of your works carry.
I think poetry kind of ruins you. It kind of ruins you for prose writing in a way, because when you write poetry, you get so focused on the micro, on the word and line and stanza level. There's a lot of there's a lot of formal features. There's a lot of oral, like sound features. I think that in one sense it's risky. Like sometimes I read stuff and I just like, sometimes when I read prose, I feel like it is too, there's too much sound going on, or there's too much clever metaphor. Like I don't want to see. It's kind of like, yeah, like what level do you want to actually be at? Do you want to be looking at each word, or do you want to be a step further back? So I think in some ways that focus can make it more difficult. For me, the division between lyric poetry and prose narrative is not so much of a biggie, because poetry has a long narrative tradition as well. So until like a few hundred years ago, all of our narratives were written in some form of poetry. So yeah, I think that's not so much of a divide as I see it.
Yeah, I think that probably a lot of people will see that as well. Rosetta, what about for you? Do you actually think about the sounds and the language as you're writing a big novel like this?
Oh, yes. I think once you're a poet, you're always a poet. It's your first love. It stays with you. So no matter what I'm going to do, I'm going to have that ear for the line. And I think it's a fine balance because I have often when I'm writing prose, I have to put my poetry away because otherwise my prose won't behave on the page. It just wants to dance around and be too pretty, and I have to like slap it around a bit and say, stop it, you just settle down, we're writing a story here. But having said that, I can trust myself that the poeticness will come through naturally because there's a natural ear. And so the line for me needs to have a musicality so that when I read it, I can feel it's got a sort of a heartbeat, and I adore that. It makes you as a poet terrible with editing because you can obsess with the editing because every line is, with poetry you're obsessing, and so you can keep going back and back and back and back and back, and you have to stop yourself from doing that as well. But it's a beauty. I feel so fortunate that I've had poetry come alive in me before I hit my prose. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that idea of editing and how that's part of the process as well. The way you read your own work, sculpt it, shape it, question it, and then finally arrive at what you decide you're going to put out there. We're sort of coming to the end of our hour, but I want to ask, I just have a couple other things that I thought might be really nice to touch on. And if you don't mind, Airini, I thought I would ask you to read a passage. I'll tell you the page 17, oh, now I can't even see it. Page 171. It is in your last story, but I'm trying to find something where it's not really giving too much away, but it's this passage that begins, I am walking down a carpeted corridor. And just reading over to where it comes to the end of that section on the next page. And the reason I thought that might be a really nice place for us to end. And Rosetta, I would love to have you read more too, but I think the piece that you read is also definitely intriguing enough that our listeners will be tuning in and going out there to find your book. But I think this is a really wonderful passage because it might tie a lot of these things together. It's got poetic language. It has a sense of the narrative. It's got a bit of the bigger themes in it. And also it arrives at this idea of women and the communication and the connection. And Rosetta, I know you said James/Billy is your hero and certainly at the center of your book, but Vicky it's really about Vicky also. And it's about these connections. And here we are, 3 women in the room. So I thought it might be really nice to hear that passage and then just talk a little bit around that idea of that connection, that greater connection that maybe we're all finding here. Airini, would you mind reading it?
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm walking down a carpeted corridor towards a set of doors. They swing open on their hinges and I enter an auditorium. It's massive and dark. It is body warm like a womb, comfortingly dim. As my eyes accustom to the low light, I look around and see rows and rows of women. They are all women. I think I hear the rustle of paper, the movement of feet. A show is about to start. I see my 4th form maths teacher and my mother's best friend, and my best friend's mother, and the writer who won that prize and then had to say goodbye to her children. Why are all these women gathered here? And why am I among them? The only thing I know they have in common is that they are no longer. I don't know all of them, but I know this. They are photographs sitting on mantelpieces, saved newspaper clippings, obituaries. They are all filed in the past. I see faces turn to me. I think I can hear a low voice saying, welcome. I think I'll stop there because I'm probably going to get upset if I keep reading it, but yeah.
Thank you for that. It's a beautiful passage and I can tell why you would get upset. When I read it, I was really moved by that particular passage. In fact, by this whole story. When we arrive at this story at the end, it is really moving and sometimes very hard to read. So thank you for sharing that. It does bring me to this idea, and Rosetta, maybe you could speak to it as well, because I'm assuming you've also read Airini's work. This idea that through all of this, there is some kind of way that you as writers are connecting with your characters, and somehow they're connecting across to each other. In your case, Airini, it's women. And Rosetta, I think there's a real connection there because, of course, it's all about love. And somehow there's this sense that love stems from the human beings. There's the mother, the sense of mother, the sense of, I don't know, I guess the role that maybe women play. So I just find that really interesting and really moving. Rosetta, any thoughts there at the end? This idea, let's bring it back to the idea of love overall.
Sorry, I just realized I was still on mute. Yes, it is about love, but it's also about self strength. And so I think that's what comes through in Airini's stories very much, is that finding through, you know, if I think about Psycho X, the one that's my dearest to my heart as well, there's that brokenheartedness. And so you can be within a relationship or outside of a relationship that has ended, and you're experiencing that brokenheartedness. And that is a physical pulling away from someone that you love. And it's in that place that you actually look at yourself and you see yourself, like in that motel, when you're away, you see yourself in a motel mirror, and you are separated from all your normal props, and you get this clearer vision of who you are, and it can freak you out a little bit. And in fact, it freaked Vicky out a lot, that then you move on to either way, moving forward on your own or making different decisions and moving forward together. And so I think there is that similarity and that connection of the female seeing herself independently of her surroundings, and then reevaluating and not so much rebuilding, but being brave enough to step forward one foot after the other, and knowing she's going to be okay.
Oh, what a great image to end with, Rosetta. That's really fantastic. And again, I think it'll make the audience quite curious. I think the last thing I would say about what both of you have brought to the page and then to readers is this idea that the characters, the people who inhabit your works, there's a kind of a vulnerability as well as that strength. And I think you both have been talking about those things through this conversation. And I think it's a really good place to end, that balance between vulnerability, which is truth, and strength, which is also truth, that idea of how you capture those in fiction. So thank you both so much. I feel like we could go on about many, many topics here, but we've touched on some really fascinating things. And you're both so generous in the way that you share your thoughts and so spontaneously speak to the way this conversation has evolved. So that's been really wonderful. And I'm sure that our viewers have enjoyed it too. So I'll close there by saying thank you to you both. And I will pass it back to James Littlewood, who's the director of the program, who will take us out for the night.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and to Airini and Rosetta. So it's such a, I was going to say I'm grateful, but it's more than that, really. I'm really honored to be in the company of three women talking about poetry, fiction, and reality. It's just, yeah, really fabulous kōrero. So thank you for that. And that idea of vulnerability and strength is certainly a powerful one for me right now, both in my life and in these times, I think. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for such a great discourse through that. Yeah, that's been a fantastic evening with Airini Beautrais, author of the Medlicott Fiction Prize Bug Week, Rosetta Allan with her novel Crazy Love, and Michelle Elvy with The Other Side of Better. Please support Aotearoa literature. Go out and buy the book at the same time as getting the Going West book. I also want to just let you know that this is there's more to come in the next two nights. Tomorrow night at 7:30, we've got Behind the Blinds. The inimitable Jackie Clark is talking about Hersey, the book about the aunties, a thoroughly different kind of literature from what we've had tonight. Hersey, survivors of domestic abuse tell their own stories. That's with Jackie Clark and the two writers, H and Te Ara. They'll be interviewed by Carol Hirschfeld with readings by the actor Renee Lyons. On Monday night, Speculative fiction raises its multifaceted head. Jack Ramel Cottrell will host a conversation with Nalini Singh, Lee Murray, and Octavia Cade, writers of just extraordinary books. There's a lot of genre fiction in there, but also a lot of experimental work, and I think that's going to be a really extraordinary conversation. So that's it from us. I guess I should just give one more plug for the donation button. If you've enjoyed what you've watched tonight, it's very easy to make a donation on the Going West website. And please keep reading, and please keep talking and sharing your ideas, and enjoying Aotearoa literature. So that's it from me, wherever you are. Ka kite anō, good night, and go well. We'll hopefully see you again tomorrow night.